Hi there, this is James Tripp. This is a video about art and science in hypnosis. Art and science. I want to look at these two things, compare and contrast them with you. I was out last night at a meeting of hypnotherapists, and a question that came up in the bar ahead of time was around standardized scripts. Use of standardized scripts in hypnotherapy. And there was a suggestion there that it could be a good thing, because with standardized scripts, you could run them through testing procedures in a more scientific arena, and then you would be working with what's called an evidence-based. You would be working with an evidence-based approach to hypnosis. The standardized scripts, you could say, we know this script works better than this script gets X% results, this is the sort of front runner, this is the best script for this particular problem. And there was an argument being put forward that this could be a good thing. Now, I do not agree with this, and it's not that I disagree with evidence-based practice. I do disagree with evidence-based practice in that strictly scientific way. I think evidence is an important thing. I think it's an important thing whether you take an artistic or a scientific approach to hypnosis. Either or, evidence is important. Now, let me just say something about art and science. Now, science is a wonderful thing. It's an excellent discipline, or the scientific approaches to things are excellent disciplines. And they have really contributed to the advancement. Some people would disagree with that term, advancement. They certainly contributed to the transformation of our lives and society. I'm recording this right now on my iPhone, which wouldn't exist if it wasn't for many, many years of scientific development, research, all of this kind of thing. Much of the technology, much of the world around us has emerged, the modern world, through the activities of science and scientific research. And we learn more and more about the world and how it works through science. However, science has not replaced art in life. Art is a freer, more creative, exploratory approach to living and being and doing. And actually the majority of what we experience in our life arises from art, not from science. Okay, we look at hard technologies like cars and phones and all of that, we can see science at play. But if you look at the way you build and maintain relationships, if you look at the way you connect with people around you, if you look at the way you influence people around you, if you look at musicians, people who play piano, if you look at people who, even the buildings that we look around us, you can say, well, there's science, there's maths, all of that involved in it. But people were building buildings. Much of that skill set of building buildings has been handed down and evolved. It's been handed down mimetically, so to speak, from the time of craftspeople, craftsmen, craftswomen, this kind of thing. So a lot of stuff isn't about science. The clothes we wear, this is all about creation and art. People didn't have to scientifically research how to make a shirt. That wasn't discovered that way. Okay, some of the materials, the modern materials that shirts may be made out of, do come from that process of scientific investigation. What I'm suggesting is life is actually more about art than science. If you take science out of life, we will still live, we will still be alive, we will still figure out how to do things, we will still figure out effective ways of doing things. Hunter-gatherers didn't have to go into the lab to find out which particular methods of getting fruit from trees work best. They just discovered it from a natural process of shaking trees, bashing trees, climbing trees, whatever. They didn't have to go into a lab or into a scientific environment to discover the best way to wrestle a piece of big game to the ground and eat it. They figured out, sharp pointy stick. They did it through a creative process, an iterative process, more of an art-orientated process than a science-orientated process. So what's the difference? Well, art, when you engage in an artistic and creative way of developing a skill set and approach, whether that be how to wrestle a buffalo to the ground or how to do hypnosis, you go through a process of learning, experiential learning. You go into the context in which you want to develop your skill set or your understanding, and you explore and you play with the variables. And evidence is an important thing. You pay attention to feedback and you check it out against your sense. You use intuition to a certain degree, but you do your very best to figure out, am I getting better at this or am I getting worse? Am I getting closer to the mountain or am I getting further away? And you just keep making adjustments until you get close to the mountain. This is true whether you learn to play tennis. Learning to play tennis is not scientific. Learning to play the piano is not scientific. Learning to do hypnosis is not scientific. Okay? But you do, if you want to get good, need to pay attention to evidence. But this is not what people are talking about when they're talking about an evidence-based approach to hypnosis or change work. They're talking about something that can be standardized and replicated. Standardized and replicated. And this creates a problem. I was engaged in a discussion the other day on Facebook about Milton Erickson. The question came up, was Milton Erickson any good as a hypnotherapist? A lot of people were being quite negative about Milton, or as any good as a hypnotist even. And there was a lot of discussion about whether his techniques or his methods actually worked. Now, the question, the perspective that I introduced to the thread was that maybe Erickson's efficacy had nothing to do with his techniques or his methods, and had everything to do with him personally, how he showed up, his attitude, his mindset, his understanding, the way he carried himself in that situation, the way he connected, the way he orientated himself mentally. Maybe Erickson's results were exclusively down to Erickson, not some specific technique that Erickson was utilizing. Now, the problem with that is if we look at Erickson like that, we have to see Erickson as an artist, as a change artist. And as a change artist, we can't test what he does because we've got nothing that we can pull out or separate out from the whole. We have a whole that we have to deal with. And science isn't good like that. Science needs to reduce things down to individual parts so as it can take variables out, other variables, and leave only one variable in that can be tested so as to get some clarity. But there's a problem with this reductionist approach. It's very powerful, it's very useful, but it breaks down at a certain point. So if you want to test what Erickson's doing, you have to pull something out. You have to say, well, let's take that thing that he did in this particular situation. Let's take it out, standardize it. In fact, we have to remove the operator variables. So ideally, we want to get a standard script. Ideally, we want to use the same recording of the standard script with different clients to see if it works. And then we can test. Then we've got this way of comparing and contrasting. Does script A work better versus script B? And then you find that script B continuously outperforms script A. That's a fantastic thing. You now have what's called an evidence base. It's a different kind of evidence from the one that the artist uses to develop themselves, but it's an evidence base. We now know script B has greater efficacy than script A. So we use script B in our therapy, and we can say our therapy has evidence base. So there's an argument there that says that's a good idea to use standardized scripts that have an evidence base for them. But here's the problem with that. That's just, to me, that seems like you're taking something live. It's so rich, it's so complex, it has so many variables in that when you render it down, it breaks down. But it's like that thing that Heisenberg said, life is not only more complex than you can think, not only more complex than you think, it's more complex than you can think. I would suggest that hypnosis, high quality transformative work, is not only more complex than you think, but it's more complex than you can think. There are so many unconscious variables involved in it. It's like riding a bike. You have so much implicit knowledge about riding a bike that you couldn't articulate. If you wanted to scientifically test somebody's bike riding technique, it would be a very, very difficult thing to do. Let's say Bob Michelson is great at riding a bike. We want to scientifically test. We want to get an evidence base for his cycling technique over somebody else's. Well, his cycling technique is built out of so many rich threads of complexity coming together that, how do we pull out the variables? We can pull out variables, and that's a useful thing to do when they are used to inform other artists. If we look at a fantastic bike rider and we pull out some elements we think are significant in making them a good bike rider, and then somebody else who wants to become a good bike rider uses that information to inform them in developing their own bike riding style, then that can be a useful thing. But if they're there saying, well, I must only replicate and do this thing, they lose touch with something. This is not how great athletes are made. Why? Because great athletes, I would suggest, are artists. They are creating something. They are creating a skill set. They are creating a skill set that gets expressed in the moment. It's no different from art in dance. People go, oh yeah, dance, I can see that's art. I can't see that doing 100 meters is art. It's exactly the same thing, we just don't label it so. Now, good 100-meter athlete, they're not using standardized scripts. Yes, science informs the athlete, but the athlete does not operate scientifically. Science can inform the artist, the musician, as much as science has to say about music and how it works, which can be useful information in helping a musician or a composer create music or compose. But it can't replace the art of it. It just can't, because it would kill it. It would destroy it. It's the same across the board. Art is like this, and I would suggest that hypnosis is art. Standardized scripts. Okay, that's fantastic. But let's take a standardized script, and let's say even if it does seem to be on, when we take it out and test it by scientific protocol, standardized script B shows up to be generally more effective than standardized script A. So now, if I'm going to be doing change work based off script B, and I sit down and I know I have to read script B in a particular way to my client, because that's the way we've pulled out the variables and tested it, and that's what the evidence base is supporting. So I do my very best to keep it aligned with that evidence base. But I ignore the client. I'm not paying any attention. So do I read the script in the same way to the client that's like this versus the client that's like this? Do I read it in the same way? Right? Let's just look at that one different variable. Client like this, client like this. You see, if I see the client like this, and there's a notion that it might be useful for them to relax, then I need to do something specific in that moment to help that client shift their state. In that moment to help that client shift their state. Well, that's not in the script. That's not in the script, regardless of whether there's an evidence base there that says script B is more effective than script A. Script B is still utterly lacking in its ability to respond to the variable that counts in that moment. Okay? So it totally ignores the live dynamic, it totally ignores the art. Whereas if you're free, you can say, and just notice whereabouts you could relax most now. That's it, and just let your shoulders go. Now, that can't be standardized into the script because it might not apply to somebody else. Or if it was, it might not apply, it might mismatch. So you can't be live, you can't adapt to the circumstances of a standardized script. I would challenge anybody to go into a sport like boxing and develop a standardized sequence for a boxing match. This is how you get a knockout in round one. And a sequence of predetermined steps that says you do this, you do this, you do this, particular combinations of punches, particular combinations of footwork, and take it into a live boxing match. You see how well that boxer does, using a standardized script for a boxing match. Right? It would be ludicrous. It would be a ludicrous thing to suggest that a boxer boxes according to a standardized script or a standardized choreography. They would get beaten. Why? Because that instance, that match is unique. They have to be live. They have to be in the moment. They have to be able to dynamically adapt. I remember people used to say years ago when I was a kid, they used to say, oh, master martial artists, they're the people that can think 5 moves ahead. No, they're not. They're not at all. A A master martial artist, a master fighter, an artist of any kind is one who connects fully 100% to the moment. They respond to what's happening, they create into that moment, and they work with the live variables that are at play in that moment. That is the way that the artist works. The scientist cannot test that. They cannot test that because everything they do has to be replicable. Whereas real life is not replicable. Each moment is unique. That doesn't mean that the boxer cannot be informed by sports science, and that cannot make them a better boxer or help them develop a more effective training regime. That doesn't mean that at all. Of course, science can inform art, but it can never replace art. Can never replace art. If you try and do that, I can guarantee one thing will happen. You will kill the art. You will destroy the live essence of what makes it what it is, what makes it so impactful, what makes it so powerful, what makes it so significant, what makes it so meaningful. Transformative work, hypnosis, it's about art. Approach it like an artist. Use science, explore science, listen to what the scientists have to say. Think about how you can use that, draw it back into your practice. Have your own evidence base. I strongly recommend this. I strongly recommend everybody pays attention to evidence and feedback. One of the biggest mistakes that most hypnotists make, or hypnotherapists specifically, is not checking in with clients over time, not finding out what kind of impact they're really having, being blinkered, being closed down, being afraid to pay attention to the feedback that they get. Open yourself up to it. A good artist does. A boxer would be would progress very poorly if he refused to accept that he ever got knocked out, if he was being knocked out all the time. Just denying it, just being in denial. Or every time he fought a subpar fight, refusing to see what wasn't up to scratch. Or conversely, wasn't paying attention to what was working. People who separate themselves off from evidence, from feedback, they don't develop effectively as artists. Someone learning to play the piano that doesn't actually pay attention to the results they're getting will not really learn to play the piano at a very high level. So evidence is important in art. Being switched on to feedback, what happens when you do this, what happens when you do that, because you're informing yourself as an artist outside of consciousness. Those unconscious maps for how you do things need to be built up and enriched so that you can operate optimally in the moments that count. All of that stuff's important. Use science, make use of it, make use of what science uncovers. Science is wonderful. Science is brilliant. Science is awesome. Science is not the be-all and end-all of life. Not by any means. Okay, so there's a little riff on art and science in hypnosis. I wonder what kind of use you'll make of that. If you have any questions about it, please do feel free to use the comment section below.